Thank you for coming to our masterclass. I'm Naomi Winstone from the University of Surrey. The guy who's not allowed to stand on the stage for fear of concussion is Sam Elkington. And also the other colleague, Karen Rabbit, of the University of Surrey, who's been working with us on this project. This project is a result of 3 years of trying to encourage change in assessment design at a whole university level, across disciplines, across colleagues who are enthusiastic about change, and including the colleagues who do not want to even hear the word AI, let alone think about its role in assessment. What I want to start by saying is that what we've done and what we've developed is not a perfect solution to the AI and assessment challenge, simply because there isn't a perfect solution. And I'm going to explain this cultural reference in case this is not familiar to anybody, but for anybody who does remember the film Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, there is a scene where in the Baron's castle, he has a group of men. He's trying to get them to develop a flying car. And they are locked in this castle until they produce a flying car. And of course, they can't produce a flying car. This is exactly how we have felt in this situation, being given the task of creating an AI-proof assessment, which does not exist, and which we simply cannot deliver on that ask. But we've learned a lot of lessons along the way, which is what we will share with you today. So, one of the most influential pieces of research for us, which unfortunately Thomas Corbyn did not write fast enough because we needed this 3 years ago, not a year ago. But this has really helped, this paper. And this is the one that I think really helps us in being pragmatic about the changes we need to make in assessment. So Corbyn and colleagues frame AI and assessment as a wicked problem. And a plug, I believe in one of the mini keynotes later, there's going to be more from this team about wicked advice for wicked problems. You can see here the features that Rittel and Webber initially assigned to this idea of a wicked problem. A wicked problem as being distinct from a tame problem. A tame problem is a relatively easy problem to solve because the boundaries are clear, the aims are clear, and we can chart a path to a solution relatively easily. A wicked problem doesn't have those characteristics. It's much harder. And you'll see here these features. All of these apply to what universities have been tasked with trying to solve. It is a wicked problem, and there is no solution. So you see these features here. The problem can't be clearly defined. This is absolutely true, because the boundaries keep shifting. And the problem is different in every single context. If you've got professional body constraints, if you've got different class sizes, the demographics of the students in any given setting. So it's not a problem that can be clearly articulated. There are no clear criteria for knowing when a solution has been reached. How do we know whether we've got a valid assessment design? What even is validity in the context of generative AI? This third one, is particularly important. There are no correct answers, just alternatives that require trade-offs. This has been so central to managing large-scale change in assessment design because we have had to have the quite difficult conversation saying you will have to make compromises. And that is just where we are in assessment design at the moment. There's no way to test solutions against clear metrics. We don't have a way of measuring validity of assessments in a way that applies across the board. They can't be solved through trial and error. This one I think is really, really difficult for us as academics where we know the stakes for our students from an assessment design. We need to experiment. We need to be trying things out, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't. But we know that for our students, the stakes are real. We don't have a trial run of an assessment to be able to see what the implications might be. We're doing it live. Infinite number of possible solutions. I can absolutely attest to this, having worked across 2,000 modules with 4,000 pieces of assessment over the last 3 years. Everything is different. Every solution is different. There are no two identical designs that have come out of this process. Wicked problems are context dependent. Best practice or universal approaches won't work. This one has really helped me because, going back to the flying car analogy, I was in one workshop with one school, which I won't name what it is, but you might be able to guess from what I'm about to say. And they said to me, "Oh, where's your flow chart? Have you not designed a flow chart that says, if I've got this type of assessment, I can press a button and it now says, this is what you change your assessment to?" I had to say, yeah, that's not going to work. There is no way of saying, this is the perfect, best practice, evidence-based solution to this challenge. We don't have that. Wicked problems are interconnected with other systemic issues. And higher education itself is a wicked problem. Everything we do is subject to multiple constraints and very difficult to test solutions and so on. And a really good example of this, so one of the constraints I was given in this process was, we are not going to allow people to choose an in-person exam in replacement for a piece of coursework that maybe is vulnerable to AI, unless there's a really good reason for doing so. And typically that was because a professional body felt that that was what a course team had to do. And this is obviously important from a pedagogical point of view. We don't suddenly want to put in exams for the sake of putting in exams, but also from a very pragmatic point of view. Another wicked problem that we have in universities, many universities, like mine, which is a campus-based university, is the wicked problem of space. Our estate would not be able to accommodate multiple in-person exams if suddenly we had even another 200 exams. So that's an example of another systemic factor, another wicked problem that interacts with this wicked problem of assessment and AI. The problem framing shapes potential solutions, and Corbin has this really nice example here of if we see the problem as one of academic integrity and ensuring ethical use of AI, or ensuring academic integrity through the process, we will look at AI and assessment as a challenge through a very different lens to, I guess, what many of us would think about in this room, which is, what about assessment for learning? How do we ensure that our assessments are meaningful and valuable for us as well as for our students? It's a different framing and would lead to different solutions. And finally, wicked problems create significant responsibility and accountability. Like the men in the basement of the castle given this challenge, for many of us who are tasked with leading assessment change, it feels like a huge responsibility, particularly when we don't necessarily have the resource or the ability to know it. So there are three here that I think are particularly important based on what we've talked about. The need for trade-offs, the need for compromise, the recognition that there is no best practice approach. What works in one discipline will not necessarily work in another. And even within the same programme, what works on one module might not work on another. And then this interconnection with other systemic issues. And the other thing that Corbin and colleagues do in this paper, which again has been immensely useful, particularly when brokering senior executive leadership in this process, has been the permissions that this framing opens up. And they argue that if we accept AI and assessment design as a wicked problem, we have the permission to compromise because it's a feature of the problem that we're working with. We have the permission to diverge, which is to say, you do what works within your discipline, and somebody else do what works in your discipline, and that's absolutely fine. We have to be led by that expertise. And finally, the permission to iterate, and this is the most challenging because we are in a very high stakes sector where student experience matters. It matters for us on a personal level, but for our institutions, it really matters in terms of the reputation of a university. But we have to accept that this is an experimental process. We will need to try new things, we will need to evaluate them, and we will need to continue to iterate. One more thing from me before I hand over to Sam. Another paper by Corbin and colleagues. Again, this is a really important distinction they draw between discursive changes and structural changes to assessment. Discursive changes in response to AI are the ones where we tell students what they can or can't do. And typically that is things like traffic light systems, declarations, where we say in this assessment you can use AI as much as you like. In this one you can only use it for brainstorming, but you can't use it for writing any text. The challenge with those kinds of responses is that they rely on clear interpretation from students. And we know, again, from the literature, that the boundary work that people have to engage in to work out what is and isn't acceptable is a significant source of anxiety. The other challenge we have is that we cannot verify whether students have done what we have asked them to do in terms of how they have or have not used it. So instead, Corbyn and colleagues advocate for structural changes. These are changes to the structure of the assessment that build in behaviour or build in approaches through the design of the assessment itself, rather than relying on telling students what they can or can't do. And what we have done, and what we will talk about today, is an example of a structural change. Sam, are you going to risk it up here, or?
I'm going to try.
Just don't move.
Sizest. Okay, so part of that structural change or shift is a shift in focus. I'll talk in a minute about how to shift onto a focus of process over product is something we've all heard about, so it's not a new idea. But it's really, through the paper and through this work here, the argument is it's the shift in an attribution of value. It's like what we choose to value, what we choose to point to as what matters most. And it's a question I ask all the time in workshops and talks and training that I do, is what does matter most in assessment? And this paper here dovetails with the argument we're making around the attribution of value to process, so and through the idea of the work. So in terms of what matters most, you're asking yourself what matters most of value, where are we placing the value in the act of assessment? Obviously we're arguing for the process over the product. But a good way of understanding that is a focus on the work. What's the work we want to point to here? What matters most? What do we want students to be doing through the assessment experience? So positioning assessment as a generative space where educational values are enacted. What values do we want to enact through our assessment designs? It's a very different conversation. And when we're talking about the work, we're talking about what we want students to pay attention to. Now, we know assessment drives student behaviour, don't we? We know this. What's the first question they ask when we meet them for day one, week one, when's the assessment? Yeah? So it drives everything. So it's a lever to be pulled. But the work means certain things, certainly in the context we're talking about here. So the attentional work, what students learn to notice. What are we pointing to as mattering most? And then what are they pointing to in their experience of the work that matters most to their learning? It's interpretive, how they make sense of what they notice, how we help shape that and support that. It's ethical work, never been more important, how they decide what matters most and how to act. And it's relational, how they position themselves in relation to the work, others, and the world. So when we're talking about the work, it's not just, it's beyond the task. It's the broader activity, the broader engagement that we want to talk to. So this requires a more holistic focus and arguing here on assessment practice, the doing and the outcome. So we need to hold, and we're certainly not arguing that, you know, outcomes don't mean anything. Outcomes are meaningful, but we need to hold both of these ideas together. So we need practice with a C, which is outcomes, but we need practice with an S, which is process. We need to hold both of these ideas together as we're starting to understand what it is, the work that we want students to be doing. So this shift in attribution of value from the product, the polished artifact, the end goal, to the process through which students have worked to produce that work is an important one. And it is about pointing. assessment is all about pointing to where the value is, and it's pointing towards process. And this is just a collection, there's more than this out there in the literature, but this is just a collection of some of the literature that points to process as being something we should be paying attention to. So this, we're not here to argue this is a new idea. What positions this work slightly differently is obviously the focus on the work, but also the method and the approach that we're proposing. So assessing the process. The interesting thing about the process as well is it's always been there. Yeah, we're not asking you to think about things that haven't existed before now. It is simply shedding a light on, or choosing to shed a light on, a different aspect of practice, and then shifting our value accordingly. So process in this context, as we talk about it, is dynamic, it's traceable. So again, going back to the work, it's having students point to what matters to them and how they've enacted that. But more importantly, point to things like actions, the decisions they've made, the errors, failure. Valuing that, packaging that, and making sense of that. And then revisions, reflections. It's not a ladder to be thrown away once climbed. It's an ongoing journey. So it's about construction, it's about composition, but as I said in the previous slide, it's about pointing to what matters most. And I think if there's something that anything you take away from today, there's plenty of things that you'll be taking away, is that what am I pointing to as mattering most? And how do I model for that in how I set my assessments up? Because we get what we model for in assessment. Yeah, we model for artifacts and products, that's what we'll get. We model for process, it's a different conversation again. Do you want to come in for the Matthew side? Yeah. So that's just you can scan that if you haven't already got the article, if you want to, just want to read it and zone me out. Just give you the choice, but over to me.
So the naming of our assessment design model as black box assessment is borrowed from Matthew Syed's brilliant book, Black Box Thinking. And for anybody who hasn't read this book, it's not about education, but it has, I think, so many rich ideas for us working in higher education. Essentially, what Syed is arguing is that the secret of high-performing individuals, teams, organisations is a willingness to engage in black box thinking. And he defines black box thinking as a willingness to look at process, to really interrogate what we've done to get somewhere. One of the examples he uses of a strong black box thinker is David Beckham. And he writes about how David Beckham, as a young man, used to go out into very small sort of backyard that he had at his house, and he would just practice drills over and over and over again. And each time he would stop and he would look back at what he'd done, and he would think about what to adjust next time. That's black box thinking, it's analysing process. And Matthew draws a really interesting distinction between two areas of practice, aviation and medicine, and how they have very different cultures of engaging in black box thinking. So for aviation, black box thinking is thinking. This is what they do. They collect evidence to be able to fully reconstruct the process of the flight. And most importantly, they use data not just to analyse error, but to analyse success, and I think most crucially to analyse near misses. And that's what has led to cumulative improvements in the safety of aviation. He argues, in some cases, that in medicine the culture is very different. He uses lots of examples of where in medicine error has been hidden or not systemically analysed, which has led to a lack of learning and a lack of progress. So the idea, I think, behind our model that makes it slightly different to generic process assessment, which, as Sam mentioned, has been around for decades. Process assessment has been there. It's the cornerstone of assessment in some disciplines. But what makes black box assessment different is that we argue there is value in assessment, particularly now, to moving away from asking students to produce the most polished, most perfect thing that they can, to actually valuing the journey that they go on, including errors, including mistakes, and what they learn from the things that they don't want to use in their work. So this is where the term comes from. And when we were working with this analogy and engaging with science work, we realised that what the black box recorder does in aviation is capture multimodal traces of process. So you can pull together the data from the aircraft instruments. You can layer over that the dialogue between the pilot and the co-pilot, and with air traffic control. And with this data, you can essentially rebuild the process of that flight. And so we started thinking about, well, what's the educational equivalent of flight data? What are the multimodal traces that are already there in what students are doing that can authenticate the learning through the assessment process? And this focus within our approach on valuing error and valuing revision and change, cognitive change, one of the things that I realised and have used in my own assessment design is I'm less interested in a polished product now. I don't really mind how perfectly something is written. What I want to know is, what has my student learned? And how have they changed through this process? And so I've started asking for the things that, in this analogy, end up on the cutting room floor. The things that they didn't include in their final assignment, and why. Because that, to me, is a really interesting insight into the process of developing work. To think about, that was there, but I had to take it out, and why. So this is, at its simplest, the black box assessment model, and we will very soon give you a chance to experiment with this model. So typically what we've done in education is we've had an input, we've given students an assessment brief, a task brief, and we've evaluated the most perfect, polished piece of work that they can give us. What's happened in between has been hidden. It's been in a black box. And that has always been a problem. So if anyone hasn't read it, there's a brilliant paper by Tim Fawns and colleagues which talks about proxies in assessment and how in assessment we work with proxies. Process evidence is often a proxy as well. It's not immune from that challenge. But we're dealing with proxies, and that has always been the case. But since generative AI came onto the scene, that black box process, the fact that students' processes are hidden in a black box, has become a problem, because we don't know whether that process that created this beautiful polished output came from them or came from generative AI. But that black box and the fact that processes are hidden could also be a pointer towards a solution, because if we can capture some of those processes in a meaningful way, we can validate students' learning. But more importantly, we can give them credit for the work that they do. And I think the framing that we use with this isn't about making you prove that you've done the work. This isn't about you, us wanting to police how you've used various tools along the way. This is about giving students credit for the work that they do and their own individual creative thinking. So what we talk about then in the model is capturing windows into the black box. And in very simple terms, a window is a piece of process evidence. Any design can have multiple pieces of process evidence, but a window is a piece of process evidence. All of this is aligned with learning outcomes. So if we are measuring process, if we are assessing process, that needs to be captured in our learning outcomes, and it needs to be captured within our rubrics. Having said that, I mentioned we worked with 2,000 modules going through this process, and there are so many different designs that have come out of it. Some people have kept the focus on the product itself, but used process evidence as more like a pass-fail element to enable students to demonstrate their own ideas. Others have gone to the other extreme and said they're not really that interested in the product anymore. They are assessing the process, and they are assessing artifacts that show how students have developed their work along the way, and many variations in between. So it is a flexible model, and it also responds very closely to disciplinary priorities in terms of what does process look like in an authentic way within a particular discipline. The use of the term windows was very deliberate as well, because we recognise that we can never fully see process. Unless we put students in an fMRI scanner whilst they're doing a piece of work. And even then I would argue that is still a proxy. That is still a proxy for learning. So windows are glimpses. They give us evidence, they give us information, but it is still a proxy. And that is the problem we have with assessment. So, the black box windows. Typically, in the history of process assessment, process has been assessed using reflection, getting students to write after the fact what they did and what they learned from it. That is still useful, and it can still be used within a process assessment, but it is the most vulnerable form of process assessment to students using AI to create a process artifact. So when we were developing this, we tried to think much more broadly about the different types of process evidence that could be captured in the process of students creating something that we would call a piece of work. And again, we will give you the chance to engage in a lot more detail with these windows in a minute and have a think about how they could apply to one of your own assessments or an example assessment. We have, obviously, through this 3-year process, created a lot of resources. We've got a lot of different disciplinary examples. We've got sample rubrics. We've got sample text for explaining this to students. And we are delighted to share any of this if it is of use to anybody. So please do feel free to reach out and email us, and really happy to send artifacts and resources your way based on what we're talking about today. Just a couple more points before we move into the practical session. This is not a magic bullet, because as we've talked about in a wicked problem framing, there is no perfect solution. And so through our experience and working with lots and lots of programme teams, we have dealt with many challenges, responded to many challenges, and there is a section in the paper as well where we do highlight some of these challenges and give some ideas in response. So I'll just briefly talk through some of these. Is this going to increase marking workload? I could bet the rest of my mortgage that everybody has thought of at least one of these. Has thought about at least one of these challenges while I've been talking. So I will briefly speak to them. Is this going to increase marking workload? Perhaps. Perhaps a change in workload is one of the compromises that we make in this situation. If it's going to increase marking workload, my solution then, and what I say to people all the time, is what are you going to stop doing to enable time to do something that really matters? And often that means stopping giving detailed comments at the end of a process, when work has been marked, when we know that feedback information is of less use. Let's stop doing the things that don't work, that we know don't matter, and instead think of workload as a resource that we can use to do the things that do matter. There are other solutions to this workload challenge. One of them is, and I've seen this work really well in many of the designs that module teams have come up with, is if you're going to start giving more weight to process, you reduce the size of the weighting of the product. So if you previously had a 2,500 word essay, and you're now including a portfolio of process evidence that is 1,000 words, you reduce the length of the essay. The product is weighted in relation to the process. There's another one, and this one relates to feedback. So in this room, I probably don't need to say too much about what we know about feedback for learning. In particular, there's a huge amount of evidence from large-scale meta-analyses that feedback on process is more useful for students than feedback on the task. So giving students information about what they've done along the way is much more useful and leads to greater gains in their understanding and their learning than information on the task that they've done. It's really hard to give feedback on the process level if we don't have insight into the process. Our research from our lab has also shown that process feedback is more memorable for students than task feedback. So there's something about this kind of feedback that could have more of an impact on students. So could we give less feedback, but by giving process-focused feedback information, that feedback have more impact on students? But this won't work in my discipline. This is definitely one that I've heard over the last 3 years. And my answer is always, well, it might not be the most appropriate solution for your discipline, but I would argue that every single human activity has a black box. Everything that we do has a black box. It has a series of steps, ideas, changes, revisions in what we do. So it's finding what is the most appropriate form of process evidence in a discipline. But students can use ChatGPT to write process evidence. This is the hardest challenge. And I do not have a perfect solution to this one, but I do have suggestions. One of them is if we are asking students to produce evidence of their process post hoc as something to validate a product that they have created, it's much harder for us to prevent that outsourcing of process evidence. If we can capture process organically, authentically, as it is actually happening, it's much less likely that will be outsourced to AI. We can also increase the cognitive cost of fabricating process evidence. Let's make it harder, or put it another way, let's make it easier and less effortful for students to actually do the work themselves. And one of the ways in which this works really well is in designs that have multiple pieces of process evidence that together have to be triangulated with one another and against the product. It's really difficult to convincingly fabricate a trail or a tapestry of process evidence to the extent that actually it's easier to just do the work themselves. We can also minimise the outsourcing of process evidence by anchoring the process to concrete artefacts, to things that are very closely situated and to work that is happening in person. So some of our designs that our module leaders have developed involve repurposing the use of class time to get students doing tasks that then form part of the process evidence. And one of the things that this has done, quite unexpectedly, is it's increased attendance. You might then be thinking, but what do we do about if students are ill for that session and they need to be there to be able to complete some task that forms part of their assessment? One of the big challenges with this work has been how we've had to intersect with all of the pieces of the assessment ecosystem. So I've been working constantly with our disability and neurodiversity team, with our academic integrity team, extenuating circumstances, learning developers. It's been very much a systemic process, and we found solutions to all of these challenges that maintain inclusivity in this context. But students will find this approach to assessment too different to what they're used to. This is a challenge because when we look at what's happening in schools, process assessment is not really featuring, even in the non-examined assessments like coursework and the extended project qualification. However, as with any type of assessment change, how we enable students to participate in a new type of assessment is through building their assessment literacy, their evaluative judgment, exemplars, opportunities to engage with criteria, live marking screencasts from us, all of the things that help students to develop an understanding of what good looks like. And at the moment we're working with a team of student partners who are developing resources, exemplars for students based on different assessment designs. So we're going to stop talking at this point and give you a chance to have a play with some of the ideas. We have, apparently, here we go. We will hand around some design sheets, again, these are examples of what we've been using with program teams, which enables you to think about either an assessment that you currently have or use, or we have an example assessment that you can work with. And we have about, I think, 10 full sets of resources, so we will ask you to sort of create clusters in this room, which is not ideal, so that we can share other resources. What we ask you to do is to think about a task and to think about what processes students use to complete the task. So think about a student working through those steps. What are the processes? And then which black box windows could be included to make these processes visible? And we've got examples of each of the types of windows that you'll be able to have a look at. Thinking about how you could prevent that process evidence from becoming performative or polished. How do we make sure that we're capturing authentic evidence of process? And then, you may not get a chance to think about this today, but just encouraging focus on these permissions that Thomas Corbyn and colleagues argue for. How can we incorporate this principle or this ethos of divergence and compromise and iteration? So we have, what do we have? We finished at 20 past? Yeah, so we have half an hour. Which gives you time to have a play with your ideas. We will come round, so if there are any other questions. If you want to know examples from particular disciplines, then please just ask. And then we will come back maybe 5 minutes before the end, just for a final plenary before we move on. Yeah, this is the sort of example essay. If you don't have an assessment design of your own to work on, then you can work on this one. Or if you're working in a group, you could work collectively on one particular assessment design that somebody has. Any questions before we move on? Yes?
I was really interested when we talked about triangulating the evidence. Last time, could you give an example of that?
Yes, so the question there was about triangulating evidence and different forms of evidence. So I'll give a simple example. This is from our psychology discipline. They had an assignment for second year students, which was a 2,000-word critical literature review, which ChatGPT can write very well, hallucinated references aside. And what they did was ask students to represent process by doing two things. One is they submit a 5-minute screencast of their search process. So they literally record and talk through in the database they're using, in the source they're using. These were my search terms. This was my first run of my search. I then refined my search terms, and these are the papers that came out of the search, and this is how I ended up with my final sample of articles for the literature review. Alongside that, they have to submit an annotated PDF of 2 articles that most influenced their thinking. And this encourages them to show how they worked with a paper, an article, what came to mind when they were reading it, how they came back to it, how they changed as a result. And then all of this feeds into the literature review. They considered using a Viva to ask students to talk through that. They also considered students then showing something about a paper that they didn't include. So lots of different examples, but if the annotations on the article are not aligned with what it is they're actually then writing about in the literature review, then those two things don't triangulate with each other. Okay, so if you...
We're ready to go. Come on.
If you kind of cluster yourselves into little groups, and then we'll come around with the resources.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you had a lovely lunch. If you're still waiting to get a seat, now's the time. Welcome to parallel session number 9. We have an amazing presentation by Astrid Voigt on designing assessment, authentic and inclusive assessment point of view. We're going to do 15 minutes of the presentation and then 15 minutes of questions, following a format that we are all familiar with at this point. Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Yusu. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk today about a piece of assessment which we designed at the Open University in Milton Keynes, and this was for a level 3 module in classical studies. And I will talk about the principles that we considered in order to design the assessment, the actual design of the assessment, and an evaluation we did, how the assessment worked in practice after it was implemented. I will start though by explaining briefly a bit more about the specific distance learning context of the Open University, or as we call it, the OU. At the OU, undergraduate students study modules at 3 different levels. Oops, sorry. Back. At 3 different levels, and they correspond roughly to the 3 years of a typical undergraduate bachelor's degree in any other university. Student can do their degree part-time over 6 years, or full-time over 3 years, and a degree in classical studies. Students need to study 2 60-credit modules on each of the 3 levels. In terms of demographics, we have a very diverse student body and a large proportion of mature students, although recently we also had an increase in registrations of younger students. We also have a large proportion of students who declare disabilities or with mental health problems, and we have a considerable number of students who are in secure environments, as well as students with caring responsibilities, or those who work full-time or do even both. Students in a particular module work through a mixture of printed and online multimedia materials, and attend live tuition online, which is facilitated by our associate lecturers, or tutors as they're sometimes called, and students can connect to each other through the means of online forums. When they start a module, students will be allocated to a tutor group, with about 20 other students, and they will complete up to 6 written assignments for any one module, and the last one is usually a bit more heavily weighted and more complex. The module, which is the context for my case study today, is a module on Greek and Roman myth, stories and histories, or the myth module, we call it for short, with around 350 students each year. With regard to the assessment design, there were 3 basic considerations when we produced this. When we produced this module, and one was to diversify assessment and give students more types of tasks over the course of the module. We wanted to make assessment authentic, to make it more meaningful for students, and we wanted to provide students with clear and comprehensive guidance and ample support to make it all work. I probably don't need to say that these strategies are all corresponding to strategies that make assessment more inclusive, and we'll just briefly go through the principal considerations here, but I suppose they will be familiar. So, diversification of assessment aims to take into account the needs and preferences of diverse bodies of students, and it takes often the form of introducing a different, less familiar or even innovative method of assessment alongside a more familiar and traditional assessment in order to give students a choice. It also aims, and that's probably the main thing, to provide students with equitable opportunities to succeed and demonstrate strength relevant to their studies. Authentic assessment is often understood as in relation to a professional or real-world scenario, and supports learning outcomes relating to employability and career development. But there's also another dimension of assessment, of authentic assessment, which I find almost as important, and that means that students can relate to the task that they're doing, to things that matter to them as an individual. And taken together, these 2 dimensions of assessment are expressed in a quote by MacArthur. Authentic assessment enables a student to find their place in society and be recognized for their contribution to that society. The last principle was supporting students with their assessment through guidance and support. That's probably sort of fairly uncontroversial and recognized as something that will provide a level starting point for all students. So what does assessment on the myth module look like? There's 4 assignments which focus on essay writing and source analysis, but for each of them the students also need to complete a communication task, either communicating to their peers on a forum or to an imagined non-specialist audience. And for their final project, students do an independent piece of work and need to identify for this piece of work their own topic. That needs to be related to Greek and Roman myth though. And there's also a communication task. And then that's where they have 2 options. For option A, students can choose to curate a one-room exhibition. And there are 2 parts to this. The first part is the exhibition proposal, where students need to set out their concept. That includes where do they want to do the exhibition, who is the exhibition for, what is it about, what do they want visitors to take away from it. But they also need to present the research on which the concept is based, and they need to explain how they want to display the objects that they've chosen in a one-room exhibition space. And for the second part, they need to produce a virtual mock-up of this exhibition space, and they use a bespoke digital tool for that, and need to create a display of the exhibits and accompanying gallery text. And on the slide is a screenshot of what this might look like. So it's a screenshot of the tool that has been used for this purpose. Curating an exhibition is an entirely new assessment task to students on the myth module and pretty much everywhere else in the Arts and Humanities school. However, at that point in the study calendar, students will have practiced talking to non-specialist audiences, and they have encountered museum curators and ancient objects in a museum context at various points in the module material. Students are also encouraged to hold their exhibition in a place that has some significance for themselves and address an audience that they can picture in their own minds. For option B, students write an academic essay in a traditional way, again about a topic related to Greek or Roman myth, but they also have a communication task, and they need to produce an audio presentation that they record or a blog post. And again, the audience is a non-specialist audience that they can choose themselves. Students will have encountered all of these tasks in the module before, and at this point, though, they are also introduced to the different formats and outputs, as well as audiences for academic research outside academia. And on the slide is a graphic from the module materials which illustrates how both doing research and communicating this to a non-specialist audience are also set in a real-world scenario. So an essay is not just an exercise that you do at university because that's how you assess people. So, in this way we were hoping to make the assessment task for both options authentic in both of the senses which I spoke about earlier. We set the task in a real-world scenario, and by asking students to write for a non-specialist audience, encourage them to think about the relevance of their research outside academia. This also allows them more easily to express themselves in their own voices. Importantly, students carry out their project independently and choose their own topic and research question. This increases their agency and creates that space for relating their own lived experience to the task. Okay. The support, that's probably the bit that's least controversial. There was a lot. Students get written material for 4 weeks of study, including online module material, assessment guidance, feedback from peers and their tutors, and different formats of live tuition. And now to the evaluation that we did, where we wanted to find out how students responded to this, to what extent the assessment was inclusive, and also whether it was a fair choice, because that's always a question when you have more than one task that you can choose from. In that year, when we did the evaluation, 279 students submitted the final project. 173 we could ask about, ask for the survey. 54 students responded, and 49 gave us permission to look at their actual submissions, which was really very, very interesting. And then we also collected demographic and performance data of the 279 students, so the whole cohort who submitted their final project. Now, yeah. One thing is, a third of the student chose the new option, the curation option, and 2/3 opted for the traditional one. Overall, optionality was very welcome to students. It felt reassuring to students of both options, and that both options appreciated that it was there, not only the option A options students. Students found it really enriching because there was a different focus on visual sources, visual objects, museum context, and so on. And they felt that it was accommodating different skill sets as well as preferences to work with particular sources or something like that. In terms of authenticity, we evaluated the two different aspects mentioned earlier. And with regard to the real-world scenario, obviously a high proportion of option A students really enthusiastically chose this option and would recommend it to other students because it offered them an opportunity to apply their skills to a practical task, which also highlighted the value of their degree outside academia. But for option B students, this was the same. They suddenly became researchers. They understood themselves in a different way. And many of them then decided that they could actually give the postgraduate course a good try. With regard to the second aspect of authentic assessment, where you bring your lived experience to the module task, that was very apparent in both in the EMA products, so the projects that they submitted, but there was also a strong sense of pride and satisfaction that the students took in working for this, and that was before they got the results, so they just found the task really rewarding. Very quickly, demographics. There was a preference for option A for younger students, slight preference by female students. Those with only A levels preferred option A, but those with few or no qualifications preferred option B. In terms of disability, in terms of employment and ethnicity, those are not in work because they were retired, because they couldn't work, they preferred option B, but part-time people, job-seeking, preferred option A, and that might be linked to age. In terms of ethnicity, we had a very small sample, but with that small sample there was a slight preference for option A. Disability, 35% of the students who submitted their final project reported a disability, and there was an overall preference for option A, especially among those students who declared dyslexia or a manual skills disability. Option B, though, was preferred by those declaring mental health or mobility issues or hearing disability, but some of the sample sizes are very, very small, so it's difficult to say something with certainty. What else? Yeah, what was really encouraging is that we were able to compare the outcomes for this final project to the outcomes of the final project of the predecessor myth module. And there was a clear lift in success or in performance, which shows that, we were able to improve the outcome of all students. And then finally, was it fair? The performance on the new myth module showed that the students on both options achieved similar marks, and the marks were consistent with their prior achievement in the overall assessment. So the final project was marked independently, but the overall continuous assessment that they completed before the final project was marked by their own tutor, and there was not a huge difference in either option. It was sort of around 1 for both option out of 100. So that seems to say that that was a fair choice that we gave them. So, conclusion, it looks like the principles that we applied, diversification, authenticity, and ample guidance and support were successful, at least to help us on the way to make this assessment inclusive and successful for students. Thanks very much. Sorry for the rush.
Thank you so much, Astrid, for such a wonderful presentation. We have almost 15 minutes for questions and thoughts, and I will be running the microphone around the room. So please raise your hand.
Hi, thank you, Astrid. That was great. Really inspiring presentation. Did you use the same or different assessment criteria for the big assessment at the end?
Yeah. Good question. They're the same criteria, but they have a slightly different weighting. So the essay in option B is marked like a normal essay, and then in the proposal, the big chunk of it is sort of like a mini essay, and again that will have the same marking criteria, but they will get for the concept extra marks, and there's no equivalent to the concept in option B. So where they need to say, where they want to do the exhibition and why they want to do it there and how that relates to the audience, that's sort of something that doesn't comply or doesn't have a correspondence in the option B. In terms of the communication task, so the gallery text, for instance, that they write, the assessment criteria to option B and the communication task, the audio presentation or the blog post are very, very similar, because the point is to make it accessible, so to people who don't know anything about it, a bit like what we had earlier, if anyone was here, about the math, what is an equation? But also make it engaging. That was sort of the main criteria, then it needs to be clear and so on and so on. But that's very similar. It's just a different medium that the communication task was performed in, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really fascinating, I have to say, especially for such a subject as well. It's really interesting to see how it's translated. It's not an area I know anything about, and I'd be intrigued to do that. Maybe it's a bit niche, but the secure environment, which you mentioned at the very beginning, and I'm aware of what the OU do in prison carceral environment, is an area that I'm particularly interested in at the moment. Is there any plans for this to be rolled out, outside of those sort of usual sort of students? As in, is it going to be put into? Is there some scope for it to be put into secure environment conditions at all, or is it already being done?
We do have students in secure environments who do study the myth module, always had. At the moment, they are only given one option, which is sort of a bit of a sore point. So thanks for asking it, because yes, that's a problem that we haven't solved yet, and that's basically because students in secure environment cannot use the digital tool. And we thought about workarounds, a shoebox or something, but then they're not allowed to have scissors in their environment. So, and there's various other ways to possibly be able to do it, but it requires a lot of extra effort that for which we haven't cleared all the conditions yet. It's sort of there's going to be what's called a life cycle review after, so the whole thing will be in place for 12 years, and there's going to be life cycle review, and I have the feeling we'll try and look at this, but at least they can do option B, and there's a fantastic service from the Open University Student Union who help the students with their research, because of course, obviously it's an independent project, so they need to find articles, books, they need to find their own sources and so on. And they can, to an extent, rely on the module material, but not for all of it. And this is a very difficult arrangement that is not always smooth, but at least we have it as an offer. And we have students in Secure Environment who have passed, and passed well, in this myth module. So, but thanks for asking, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi. So I'm over
Oh,
here.
sorry.
I'm over here.
Yeah.
I thought the data around the amount of students that choose option B is interesting in itself, and that's not something in the scope of this. But I wondered, because this is just a singular module, right? I assume there's other modules that they're doing at different times, and I wonder whether they get the same options or get a chance to do these other kinds of assessments throughout the program of the degree, or is it just this particular module that it happens in at the moment?
There are sort of diverse assessment tasks in other modules. This particular task about the exhibition is specific to this module. So, and this is only in place for, I think this is coming up to 4 years now, and we had to do a pilot just to make sure it all works and to work out the assessment criteria and so on and so on. But I could imagine that, now that everyone knows it works, it might get further. But the things like the audio presentation or the blog post, that's something that other people do, and they might also do like a art history, for instance, a catalogue entry or similar things, picking up debates from the current discussions in the newspapers or whatever, that type of thing. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Hi Astrid, thank you very much. I really like your work and what you shared. I'm just intrigued as to what did the staff members who were teaching and marking on this module and the assessment, how did they find it, and did they mark across both options?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, we did a tutor survey, partly in order to get a bigger picture of the student experience, because of course between them, they will have seen all the students and how they approached this, and they will have supported them also with a formative assessment. It's a very low graded one where students need to submit a plan in order to, say this is my topic, these are my sources, this is the option that I want to do, and so on. So yes, they will teach both options. And for the markers, there's a small team of around 6 to 7. They will mark across both options. And it was really interesting because we asked about, apart from the student experience, sort of from their perspective, we asked the tutors as well about how, to what extent they thought that both options fulfilled the learning outcomes. Because again, that was something, is it fair? Can you just do that? And will it do the same thing as the other option? And it was, so no one said, no, not at all. So they could say, yes, fully, or partially, or not at all, or something in between. But I think, apart from one outlier, they all agreed that the learning outcomes were at least partially met by both options. But the markers had a much more positive approach. So they had seen the whole range of submissions, which the tutors who only mark up until to the plan will not have seen. And they were much more positive about how well both options fitted with the marking criteria. And yes, both options, or the option A needed to be socialized a bit. So it wasn't like super happy to start with. But I think now everyone's got used to it. Option A takes a bit longer to mark, but the markers are usually quite happy because it's a nice thing to do. So there's a bit of a trade-off, but yeah, it's all a process of socializing and getting used to that format for tutors who taught it in the markers as well.
Any hands up that I don't see?
I can't see any hands.
Well, I would have a question actually, so I'll take the opportunity. Astrid, I think you mentioned briefly about like student identities as well, but some of them even considered postgraduate studies.
Can you say that again?
Did you refer to like student identities as well in one of your
Yes.
slides? That sounded fascinating. Could you elaborate a bit? I think you mentioned that some of the students started to consider a kind of a researcher pathway.
Yeah.
Postgraduate studies.
Yeah.
Could you just elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, it's so this was basically for option B, where we didn't quite expect. We made a huge emphasis on this is also authentic assessment. You just don't see it that way because no one ever told you that an essay is actually what a researcher produces, but that's not the only thing a researcher produces. And then we had a couple of students who, in the feedback, so the qualitative feedback, said it was a really great thing. Finally, I could sort of try and have a more professional approach to what I think research looks like. Another said, yeah, it was what I thought postgraduate study would look like. And the tutors as well said that this was something that they saw in their students, that they boosted their confidence, but also in combination with the communication task, it felt, or students said that they would find their own voice. So looking at it from the same thing basically, from two different perspectives and needing to explain it or convey it to different audiences, that had also a particular dynamic for both options. So yes, we had a couple of students who thought, yeah, postgraduate study, that's now my thing to do. Whether they did it or not, I don't know, but clearly it was sort of a pre-program for that.
That's a pretty, even if it was just a couple of students, that's a pretty fascinating outcome for any assessment task.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. If not, I'm sure Astrid, you will have some time to catch up with someone if someone wants to have a chat. Could we, in that case, then give a round of applause? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, let's go.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yang Yang. I'm a senior academic developer at London School of Economics, and I teach on PG Cert, which Jenny is the PG Cert in Higher Education Program Director, and I teach about assessment and feedback. And in this talk, we're going to give you a case about replacing a written assignment by an oral assessment with our colleagues at RC. And Jenny will start with more context.
Hi. Okay, so we're going to look at why we started to examine different forms of assessment design. Then we're going to get onto the actual instance that we're talking about on the PG Cert, and we've carried out an evaluation of the impact of doing this. So those are the three stages we're going to go through. So first of all, at an institutional level across LSE, we've been looking at implementing oral assessment for various reasons. I mean, I hate to say Gen AI, but you know, it's there. But we realised once we started looking at it that perhaps, although lots of people had done Vivas and things like that, they hadn't carried out oral assessment in this kind of context, at this kind of scale, for undergraduate students. So observed assessment, or what some people have been calling secure assessment, is now actually compulsory within the school, so there must be a certain percentage of observed assessment. So what we wanted to do was use the PG Cert as a way of exploring these issues further. We do have a working group within LSE, but we wanted to be able to sort of really like put it into a learning lab and examine it in more detail. So the PG Cert HE basically is, we have about 90 people on it every year. All newly appointed assistant professors have to take it, but it also has a lot of teaching fellows, GTAs, those sorts of different kinds of people on it. So it's quite a mixed group that actually take it. It's the usual thing for a PG cert. It's 60 credits at level 7. Got there for a minute. And module 4 is the assessment and feedback module, and it is an elective. So we have 2 compulsory modules, and then we have 5 electives that they choose from. And so, as I've already said, we wanted to create experiential evidence in the context where many staff don't have any. Okay, so we wanted them to experience it as a learner. So when they have an observed assessment, when they have an oral assessment, they are then the student rather than the teacher, so it's a whole different experience. We wanted to have a dialogue around practice, and we wanted them to think about the design. So, what did we do? When we're talking about dialogic, we're not just talking about the dialogue that takes place in the oral assessment, we're talking about the dialogic nature of learning a new skill, you know, as a whole. So what we have is a whole group of people who are coming with various notions of what it means to learn, and therefore what is valid assessment. We assume a shared vocabulary. Very often it isn't not, it isn't rather. Bearing in mind that, although it's the London School of Economics, we do actually teach more than economics, yes? So there's different kinds of vocabulary used in different disciplines. And then, as I mentioned before, there's different groups of people on our PG cert. So some of them are assistant professors, some of them are GTAs. And there is a real discrepancy there in their identity, the status that they hold within the university. And if anybody's ever worked in a Russell Group university, you'll know that status is all. And of course, for our GTAs, they can feel very vulnerable as they start out as early career academics. So what we've done is we've tried to bring together a structured dialogic process, but within a bounded environment. So bounded by both space and time. It's just within the PG cert. And so we start with, we start with an online activity that the students, so in other words, the professors, explore basic concepts, test their understanding. Then we bring them into the classroom and we do a whole day workshop where they explore these things in more detail. And then they actually go away, look at their own practice, identify areas that they want to make changes to, and prepare a very brief one-page document, and that is when they come into the oral assessment. Sorry, I probably whipped through that, but that is I believe you'll get the slides afterwards, but this is kind of a representation by Jan. Did you want to add anything to that, Jan? Because I have rather zoomed through it.
Maybe just add, like, we want to see the dialogue in the, like, the first slides show, this earlier slide shows it's kind of bounded. We want to highlight the constraint of the time, so we only have a limited time in contact with our colleagues. So any dialogue is confined by the time and space, and that's why we try to figure out assessment feedback to the contested curriculum. You can't have so many things to include, but which ones should be introduced first, and should we focus on the knowledge, the concepts, or should we focus on the social dimension of assessment and feedback practice, so the colleagues can, higher education practitioners can function socially within the institution. So we choose to prioritize the dialogic nature or the social nature of assessment and feedback design, which means you engage with your students, external examiners, and also co-teaching colleagues. So it's not an individual decision-making process. And that's why we introduced the online activity to seed, to open the dialogue, and then to create a flow which leads to the oral assessment. So dialogue happens from the very beginning, and the dialogues continues even after the oral assessment. And that's the idea of the pedagogic design.
Beautifully explained, so much better than me gabbling through it. So the actual oral assessment, they book a 45-minute slot. The actual assessment takes 30 minutes. What we do want, obviously, is for them to be able to outline their proposed changes to assessment and why they're doing it. But then it is our job as examiners to ask questions and try and clarify any areas that perhaps in the moment they've lost sight of. So although it's a 45-minute booking, that's there because, people can't get online. That's a precautionary thing. So the actual activity takes 30 minutes. They select one or two pieces of evidence to support their arguments, and these can be evidence, literature. It can also be evidence such as performance of students in previous cohorts. They actually then present and then we question. We've done 20 oral assessments in this year. And Yang, you might like to say something about the unique questions.
Okay, so to ensure the experience is fair and equitable, we share a couple of question prompts in the first year, and also we use teaching cases during the workshop. So each teaching case is a specific teaching context, and they have already experienced the questions. But to review all the examiner, assessor's questions, we identified 86 unique questions asked over these 20 oral assessment sessions.
Right. And I'm not sure how clear that is on that screen, unless you've all got fantastic. But whilst obviously when we're carrying out the dialogue, we're assessing at the same time. So this is the sheet that we use as we're listening to the students to just to explain, all of our modules are marked on either a complete or a not yet complete basis. So nobody fails. Yeah, they've either met all the assessment criteria or they have to do some further work. So that's what not yet complete is. And we're going to talk now about the evaluation.
So what we try to show you is in our conception, the future-looking approach to assessment design. And by that is we show that we try to, all the keynote speakers and other speakers talking about the uncertainty of assessment. So when we conceptualize this module, we think we want to give colleagues the dialogue capacity to engage in the uncertain future. So that's why we try to frame the whole module around dialogues. And so the first question we ask is, did the continuous dialogue develop individual colleagues' evidence-informed dialogue capacity for assessment and feedback? So imagine we are colleagues and we all have some capacity for dialogue. And that's why we are here for the assessment and feedback conference, which means we have capacity to discuss, debate about assessment feedback. And that is one of the things we want our colleagues on the RSE module have as well. And the second one, the future-looking approach is as an institution, RSE, we have very limited experience for oral assessment. We probably have one oral assessment a couple of years ago in our maths department, but no other existing institutional knowledge about it. So we've tried to use and create oral assessment as a collective innovation among us. So whether this experience enabled them to, as an institution, have more understanding and experience of oral assessment. So these are the two questions we ask. And by looking at the oral assessment transcripts, we identify 4 themes. It's similar like our module learning outcomes, but the focus is pretty much on the dialogic dimension of assessment and feedback. And I'll just quickly show through. The first one is connect theory, evidence, and teaching context. And these are 2 examples from the oral assessment transcript. And the first one, you can see the participants is drawing on from evidence to inform what is the decision to make, and to also highlight what evidence to look into their practice. And the second one is more theory application, which is talking about self-regulation. Self-regulation is actually the key theory colleagues talk a lot about in the assessment feedback module. And then how this theory applied in their teaching and learning decisions. So this is our first dimension of dialogue competence we see emerging from the dialogue. And the second one is move from assessment description to assessment rationale. And if we compare with their dialogue transcripts with their previous written assignment, this is quite obvious, is they keep referring back to justify their decision making rather than describing what their summative or formative assessment is about. And this is trying to give justification, rationale to engage with the dialogue. And the third one is responding to different stakeholders. like I think across institutions, we always need to talk to colleagues about my assessment design, what change I want, and what kind can you help me. And this is what we try to make the colleagues to see their needs in a bigger frame, in a larger frame, and to have a dialogue with people around them or with people they haven't met, like the external examiner or future external examiners. And this is where they talk about how their plans for changing assessment and feedback will engage with multiple stakeholders. And the fourth dimension we see is they talk in a dialogue, oral format. They talk a lot more about uncertainty and trade-offs around assessment because we, like one of the keynote speakers talked about the wickedness of assessment design. There's no right or wrong, but it's more about your perspective. So the more we want our colleagues to be aware of the trade-offs and how they make their judgment. This has shown through the dialogue as well. And the second research question is insights gained from the oral assessment experience. Our colleague Jonathan Scoot, he has after the oral assessment experience, he interviewed our colleagues to find out their experience of assessment as a learner, but thinking about whether they will adopt oral assessment into their own course context or program context. And we group our questions around validity and rigor because our assessment was proposed as a way for a secure assessment, and does it achieve this intended purpose within our institutional context? And the second one is fairness and defensibility. Is it equitable and justifiable in their perception after they have experienced it? And the third one is practicality, implementation. We talk about workload, time constraints as well. And the final one is what it does to learning feedback and staff, the people, the community. So I'll quickly run through the slides. So the answer is we have reached some kind of sentiment as a collective group, but also there are always kind of varying views, and it's showing that if as an institution we're moving forward to think about adopting oral assessment as academic developers, what kind of relationship we can build around with them. And it's like most of our colleagues from qualitative departments will think it's high validity for live reasoning and factual knowledge and low for revised literature-grounded argument. And they also feel some fields this can enable deeper reasoning, and some others feel like it's because written work, it feels like deeper reflection in the written work. And in terms of equitable and justifiable, fairness is the biggest concern our colleagues have, and most of the time they were thinking about my adjustment plan, which is how do you adjust the assessment for different students. And so they highlighted the importance of explicit criteria, advanced prompts, which means giving students some prompt questions beforehand, and also calibration and clarity. And but there is also most of the key concern is like the confidence or emotion side of relating to this. And we also asked them after they experience it, can it be run and how? And some participants saw oral assessment as efficient and focused, but on the other hand, it's sort of unfamiliar. So it's kind of make us have a more nuanced approach of what oral assessment means for them, because oral assessment doesn't mean the same thing. Yeah. Yeah, and then the last one is impact on the student learning. So how you can prepare students. Like our pedagogical model is continuous dialogue to oral assessment, and we want to promote this idea of if you want to run an oral assessment, probably construct a whole pedagogy around dialogue rather than giving students some preparation before oral assessment and then having the oral assessment. So that is our talk.
Thank you.
Everyone, welcome to the final session. I have the privilege of introducing our final keynote speaker, Dr. Renske de Klein. She is Associate Professor at the Education Centre at the University Medical Centre of Utrecht. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to her. We'll keep questions to the end.
Thank Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. And as the keynote speaker yesterday said, it feels a bit weird to be the keynote speaker in front of so many friends and superstars, people I admire. This bottle here is my feedback cue. So I tend to talk fast, especially when I'm a bit nervous and enthusiastic. Guess what? So if I'm going too fast, you can help me by saying, Renske, maybe take a sip of water. I have my water here. I'll take the feedback. Take a breath, take a sip of water. You can help me with that. No walking out of the room and saying to each other, that woman, she talked fast, without having given me the opportunity to slow down. This is a picture of our campus in which we have the largest rainbow cycling path in Utrecht in the Netherlands. It's also where we host the early SIG meeting this August. So I hope to re-see you, some of you there again. Then, first I thought I'd share some highlights of my CV with you. Not to brag, but rather on the contrary maybe, because I feel very excited that I can share some of the research we've been doing in our research group over the past years. But those are the successes, things that made the end line and that were published. And I thought maybe to put a bit of balance, I will share some other things with you. So my feedback CV, some highlights. When I wanted to play the flute, when I was 9 years old, the teacher said, I won't teach a girl, after my first test class, that has any talent. In secondary school, one of the bullies that I tried to address said, who do you think you are, Dr. Phil? My plan A was to become an actress, but acting school after my auditions said, 3 of them, we don't see enough talent for this person to become an actress. My plan B became to study musicology, but my high school teacher in music said, you will hate studying musicology. When I was a little bit disappointed that I didn't graduate with honor in my research masters, and I approached my supervisor to ask her, was I even close? She said, I never thought of you as a student that would graduate with honor. When I finished my PhD, or was finishing my PhD, I asked my supervisors, what do you think I should be doing after this PhD journey? And one of them said, we both know you're not a real researcher. You're not willing to do what it takes. You don't want to move countries. You will live in the Netherlands, in the same province for your whole life. You won't work at a prestigious university. You're not a real researcher. Here I am. A colleague in 360 degrees feedback said, what I would wish for you is that you would put things in perspective a bit more. Een beetje relativeringsvermogen for the Dutch people in the room, because you take everything so serious. When I first thought I wrote a brilliant paper, I sent it to my mentor, and he said, I will give you feedback. All his emails up until that day started with, Dear Renske, but now his response was Renske. I read the first 10 pages, I have a lot of comments. I don't think it makes sense for me to read any further until you've worked on them. He didn't even get to the point I was so proud of, because that was beyond page 10. And recently, I'm sure you recognize this, and maybe this reviewer is even in the room, because it's anonymous. The focus on X is relevant, has clear implications, however, there are several conceptual and methodological issues that currently limit the clarity and impact of the paper. We can revise, and I told my colleagues I would do it after this keynote. Just to make sure you don't think everything I do is successful, not at all. Then before we start, a little bit about the title. Students as feedback users. In one of the projects that we did, we really made an effort to replace the word feedback receiver with feedback user. And it was because Tineke Westerveld had the idea of making a rubric for feedback skills that students need to develop during higher education, during their time with us at university. We thought we would make a rubric. We ended up with making a framework, and we deliberately said we will call the feedback information giver, the giver, but the receiver, we will call them the user. Because what's in a word? Receiving feedback is not enough. It is our intention that feedback is used. So we try now to change our vocabulary into feedback users. I also showed a picture of Tineke because she unfortunately she didn't get to live to see the final version of the framework that we named in her honor. So it ended up being the Westerveld Framework for Interprofessional Feedback Dialogues, and I will use every opportunity to show her picture and to say her name out loud. In this talk, I will mainly focus on the feedback users, or the intended feedback users. But that's not to say that it doesn't matter anymore how the feedback is given in this new feedback paradigm. And it's interesting, because if we ask students, in what fields do you think you would need to learn most as a feedback giver or as a feedback user? Here we said receiver because they found it confusing. Then we see most students think they need to develop as feedback givers rather than feedback users. But the fact that we couldn't use the word feedback user in there was enough reason to keep focusing on feedback users. If there's one thing I can say, or want to say, and share with you of the feedback giver side, it would be the cover of my dissertation in 2013, which I used the visual of this chameleon. The whole idea that giving feedback is not following a recipe, but is being adaptive to the student, not to what they want, but what your idea is of what they might need to further progress their learning and their work. And the chameleon will come back later in this keynote. But if I say feedback user, maybe I should very briefly tell you what feedback I used and what feedback I didn't use. I never touched the flute again. I did not become Dr. Phil, but I did get a PhD degree in social sciences. Maybe my classmate was quite right. I'm Dr. Feedback now. I didn't become an actress, but I'm on the stage today. I indeed hated to study musicology, which I did. I will never regret it, because there it is where I met the love of my life, now husband of our 2 boys, Roy. I didn't graduate with honor, obviously. I struggled with the "you're not a real PhD researcher," but I had enough mentors to help me overcome that, and now I really feel like a real researcher. I still struggle with putting things in perspective. I tend to overwork. I have slept an hour before I was ready to give this keynote. I wrote the paper anyway that my mentor said he read the only first 10 pages. When it was accepted, I couldn't believe it. I thought the system had made a fault. I went onto Twitter to send a message to the editor and said, "I think there was a system mistake, my paper got accepted." He responded, "No, you're fine, it was actually accepted." And if time will allow, I will tell you a little bit about the unpublished paper that I was hoping to present to you, but is still in review currently. Then, the real content. There's 4 parts. I want to start with the problem, then the dream, the design, and then a plot twist. And maybe a sneak peek if time will allow. But first, the problem. What is the problem with feedback and with students and feedback? Interestingly, in the journal Academic Medicine, in every issue they have a last page in which there is a poster that summarizes research on a specific topic. And a couple of years ago, there was a poster that was called 6 Common Pitfalls in Feedback Conversations. So in our research group, we thought, this is great, because this is exactly what we are trying to study. But when we looked at those pitfalls a little bit more closely, we saw all the pitfalls are about feedback givers. Nothing about feedback receivers, let alone feedback users. So what started with a joke ended with us responding to this last page with our own last page, in which we developed the 6 pitfalls of feedback receivers and users. These are the colleagues we did it with. Those are not the 6 pitfalls, because I will present them to you now. The first pitfall that we described was that there's no questions being asked. Students passively wait for feedback to come their way. And that's a problem, because that would mean that no feedback is also feedback. Because students can interpret no feedback as, that was good. And students that trip into this pitfall say things like, oh, you never commented on that paragraph in the earlier version. I thought it was okay. In other words, you're now no longer allowed to comment on the paragraph. You've seen it before. And then you didn't say anything about it. I think that's a problem. What we see maybe more in medical education is my working hypothesis, since I shared this with a few groups, is that students ask for feedback when they think they did well. So not when they are insecure or they worry, but when they are fishing for a compliment. I did well, right? That's not the feedback starter that gets the conversation going about feedback that you can actually learn from. Then we see the external attribution pitfall, the what do you know to the feedback giver. And these students only seek feedback from the people that will grade them, for instance. So they don't think that peer feedback is relevant. Because what does my peer know? They don't think that maybe customer feedback is relevant. But because what do they know? I only care about those who grade me. Another pitfall would be the emotional reaction. But. It was always an external cause. Why they didn't do it well enough so far. And I think we all recognize this. One colleague at some point said, I have this with my yearly annual progress review. When my supervisor is telling me what I can improve. Then I also feel, but. Because my supervisor, when does he really see me work? Then we have the accept all changes, or the SU-ish pitfall. Students that don't really analyze the feedback that they received, but they just do whatever they are told. And students in this pitfall, they would say things like, hey, but earlier, in the earlier version, you told me to do this and that, and now I did it, and now you want me to do something else. They're not critically working with the feedback, but they're just being executors of things we say. Last pitfall. I got challenged to sing in this keynote. I will. Because the final pitfall is, and I think you will recognize it, thank you for the feedback, but I won't use it. The student says, thank you for the feedback, chapter closed, but they do nothing with it. And you see their follow-up work, and then you're like, you said thank you for the feedback? I even asked you, do you know what you need to do? Yes, is what the student said. I see their follow-up work, and I don't see any changes. This is a problem. All those students doing all these things we don't want them to do. But maybe the question is this a student problem? Or is this a design problem? Is this a teacher problem? It's a rhetorical question. I don't think the students are the problem. I think it is up to us that we are clear of the behavior that we do expect of the students, and then make designs that actually invoke those behaviors. So, let's move on to the dream. What is the student behavior that we would actually want to see, other than the opposite of those 6 pitfalls? That would be quick. For me, that started with reading this life-changing paper. I, up until then, had never heard of the author, Winstone, but I was sold immediately. In my dissertation, I had studied students' perceptions of feedback, and I thought, I represent a researcher that studies the student's voice. But after reading this review of Naomi and colleagues, I realized it doesn't really matter how the students perceive the feedback they get if I don't know what they actually do with it. And how do we teach our students to use feedback? So I thought I'd write kind of a follow-up review on this one. No pretentious there. To summarize the research that was already known, explaining how we want students to work with feedback. I just didn't find a lot of it. So then I thought, let me just start by making something. Compiling the literature that I can find, compiling it with my practical experience as a consultant, as a PhD student, as a supervisor of master students. And then I came up with these 4 activities that I would hope students to engage in when they are in feedback processes. I would hope they would seek for feedback and make sense of it rather than just accept all changes. That they then use it in their performance and then ideally respond back to the feedback giver, either me or their peers, what they did with it, what they struggled with, and whether or not that led to additional questions maybe. But while I was working on this, another big paper came out. The feedback literacy study of the 2 Davids, and then I was like, oh no, now I need to relate to this work. And it took me, first I thought I will just stop and write the original paper, but then I realized, no, I think what I was trying to do was be 1 layer more specific about what's the taking action that I would hope students would engage in when they have feedback to work with, or a feedback opportunity to work with. So, this is about taking action. Hopefully visible behavior that students show when they work with feedback, when they're actual feedback users. So let's dive into that a little bit while I check the time? Sip of water time? Okay. Because these two activities are about interaction. Interaction with the feedback giver or interaction with the person that they present their improved work to. And what are the kind of questions that I so far encountered in my own practice that students ask if they ask for feedback? These are the kind of questions. I'm stuck, what should I do? Is this good or is this good enough? Or tell me everything I need to improve? Or is it good enough now? So they handed in some work, they received feedback, they supposedly worked on those comments, and then they want to know, is it good enough now? And what these kind of questions have in common is that they are quite information poor. They send every responsibility to the feedback giver. You solve my problem. And that's not what we call Westerveld thinking, in which we have a framework for feedback with an information giver and an information user next to each other who share responsibility for effective and efficient feedback processes. One more model. Maybe I realized my references are all at the top, at the bottom. You just don't see them when you're in the back of the row. But in Vygotsky's work, there is this notion of the zone of proximal development. And even though I know that it's not uncontested how we now use Vygotsky's work in our pedagogical sciences, what I really think is helpful about the idea of the zone of proximal development is that there is a zone of actual development, a domain of things students can do without our help. And that's not what we target feedback for. We target feedback for the zone of proximal development, the thing that they can do with a little bit of help from a more knowledgeable peer. But there's also boundaries to that zone. And if you cross that boundary, you'll be in the panic zone. So you cannot give all the improvement points on a piece of work of a student, because that will by default overwhelm them, probably. So with our feedback, we would aim for the zone of proximal development. But in order to do so, we would have to know what the zone of actual development is. And I think students can help us with that in how they seek for feedback. Because how otherwise can the feedback provider be this adaptive chameleon in how they give feedback? So rather than saying, I'm stuck, what should I do? I think it might be interesting to have students start with, what's the problem that you run into? What is the current situation? And what options can you think of solving that problem for yourself? Because that would be their zone of actual development. And it would prevent us from giving feedback to which the student responds, but I knew that. Okay. And then we would want students to weigh the options. What are the pros of number one? What are the cons of number two, maybe? And what would you do if there was no feedback opportunity? What would be your preference of these options? Then the student did a lot of the thinking work and the preparation work themselves, and then they can ask for feedback. What do you think? So the feedback provider can say, well, the problem that you sketched is not the most prominent problem I see in your work. Maybe we need to redirect to another topic. Or there's another option that you haven't considered so far. Or there's other pros and cons, or I would weigh these options differently. Or the feedback is just, well done. Your preference is well weighed and a good way to solve your problem. And I'm not sure if you noticed, I could have used slightly different words, but I chose these purposefully, because they would lead to the word power. And I think it nicely conveys the idea that an information-rich feedback question is not a sign of weakness, but is a sign of power, is a sign of strength, of agentic feedback behavior. The reviewer of the paper was not convinced whether I started with the power letters and then sought literature with it, but I can assure you I started with the literature and then made it work for the acronym. For the responding part, how they respond back to us when they have used feedback, their question is it good enough now? I also want to replace that with an information-rich alternative that gives us more insight in the zone of actual development of the students. So what I would want them to start with is a summary of the feedback they received, especially if we were not the feedback givers in that context. And this is where I always reference also the work of Dave Cardis, who showed in his papers that the intended feedback is often not the perceived feedback. We cannot assume that if we said something, that the message has come across. So that's also why this summary, I think, is so relevant, because this will help us see whether students understood the feedback in the first place. Then how did you use the feedback? How did you analyze it? How did you make sense of it? And maybe also, what elements did you decide not to take up on because you disagreed or you didn't understand them well enough? And then highlight in their product or in their performance, where can I see your feedback use? The water bottle on my slide is a sign of my feedback use. I received the feedback, I talk too fast. I work with it and I try to build in scaffolds to help me keep it in mind. Yes, then the E for emotional impact. Initially I thought maybe managing emotions should be part of the 4 main categories. But then I realized that writing something about how students should manage emotions is so complicated. It's not even my field of expertise. But I think we do need to acknowledge, obviously that's why also managing affect is in the feedback literacy framework, that feedback is emotional. And yes, the E fit my acronym better than the FF. Because this could also have been feedback on the feedback. How was it to work with the feedback you received? And that's feedback to the feedback giver. Was it too harsh? Was it too much? Was it too vague, maybe? And then the students can end with, do you indeed think my work has improved as a result of my feedback use? Hold your horses with the photos, because I want to show you this. This leads to super. Also to convey the idea, if you tell us how you engaged with the feedback, it'll help you to become a super feedback user and to make super performances, super products. We made a video of it with really nice visuals of my former colleague Helvina. I don't appreciate feedback on my hair on the day of filming. And I get back to the video in just a bit, how not to use it. The second part is sense-making and using of feedback. That's the part that we usually do not see. So students leave the room. Do you understand the feedback? Yes, I understand the feedback. But then they're alone or with their group, they open their laptop, they take a deep breath. Now what? And I also wanted to compile what we knew from literature about how do we want students to make sense of feedback? What kind of steps do we want them to go through? I didn't really find anything. So if you know of any of these studies, please let me know. I'm still open to that. But in order to try and make a start to fill that gap, I made up something that made sense to me. No acronym here. But I was inspired by the work of our PhD student, Renée Filius. And in her dissertation, we really focused on deep learning. Because I think that's what we would want to achieve with students. Deep learning rather than the accept all changes mode. And in her dissertation, we said for us, deep learning is critical thinking, so not taking things, just accept them as they are, integrating new knowledge, and creating new connections between knowledge items that are already in your memory or in your system somehow. And based on that, I was thinking, well, maybe I would want my students to analyze the positive feedback comments, because I think they generally step over them way too easily, as if they are just motivational things, but I think there's something to learn from positive feedback. Then look at the improvement points, maybe summarize them. And an often heard complaint of teachers is the idea of local and specific feedback. So when there is very specific feedback on an item in students' work, for instance, in their written work, the student will use it only in that specific place. While teachers often say, I would really hope that my students take those local comments and also apply them elsewhere in their work. But do we tell students that that is our expectation? I would want them to analyze contradictions in the feedback they received. For instance, when they receive feedback from multiple peers and there's contradictions in there. And I would want them to analyze, where do I have a difference of opinion? Where do I disagree with the feedback that I received? So that they know that this is also an option. So I made lists for things. And I think we need more research into how students make sense of feedback, how to actually engage with it in order to better understand how we can support their sense-making process. And I want to share 2 of my favorite papers of other authors with you that in a very, I think, creative way shed a bit of light on how students make sense of feedback. And the first one is of Renske Bauer, we share the same first name, and Kim Dirks. What they did was eye track how students were revising their written assignment while also reading the feedback they received, to try and understand how do they work with the feedback. So I tracked 16 students and they found 3 processing strategies that really matched my ideas after I had already written them down, I have to admit. But they saw a group of students had superficial processing strategies. So they just read through the feedback linearly and then not really critically engaged with it, or revised the text only where it was really necessary. Then there was local processing. The students that just used the feedback in that specific place and nowhere else. And then there was a few students who showed these more deep processing activities and also made changes as a result of the feedback on uncommented parts. And I think that's really the type of feedback use that we would hope for. So I think it's hopeful that they did find it already, albeit in a small group of students. My second favorite study is of Rachel Esterhazy and Kina Damsa. And what they did is they analyzed feedback talks. So there were 3 groups of 3 students, and they recorded how they were working with the feedback they received on an assignment. And they analyzed how these students make explicit their thought processes, that when they do that individually, it just is unseen, and it is unspoken. And what they also found is that there's a constant switch between the specific task and local things, but also the more generally disciplinary context in which that assignment is given. And I think those 2 studies are just wonderful examples of what we can do as researchers also to try and understand that process of feedback sense making a bit more. So what I would dream of is students that proactively, or whenever they have the opportunity, seek for feedback, ask information-rich questions that matter to them, that then they make sense of the feedback in a deep way that leads to deep learning, and then communicate back to us what they did with feedback, what additional questions they might have. So, then it's just a matter of designing opportunities for students to do so, right? And of course, I can make lists, but 2 teachers from Fontes Hogeschool made a game, a feedback processing game. And I thought it was so funny, and in a few steps, it guides students towards how to make sense of complex feedback they received. So it's kind of intervision, where every student brings a piece of complex feedback, and then there's multiple rounds of cards to draw with follow-up questions, with reflection questions, with action questions, finalizing questions. And the interest, what I think is very funny, is what they did. They included the nanny card. So if you use an opinion, an advice, or a judgment, one of Nan's favorites, you're sent home. And you cannot talk for the next round, and then you get the nanny card. So if you tell someone, you know what you should do, that's not the idea. The idea is that it helps students in analyzing their own feedback. But of course, we don't have the time to let students play card games every time we give them complex feedback, or they received complex feedback, if we are not the source of the feedback. So then what? Just make it mandatory. Just make sure that students, when they present their work to us, and they know they're going to get feedback, that they have to ask a feedback question. And when they hand in their supposedly improved work, make them write a super cover letter in which they address it. Well, 2 examples of how we try to do that. One is with Charlotte Eichelboom, a PhD student in medical education. She completed. And she studied medical students' approaches to patient feedback. And we made it mandatory. So So we told the students, you have to ask for feedback to the patients that you've worked with. And then we asked them with a pre-questionnaire, what are their beliefs on patient feedback, what do they think is the adequacy of that feedback, and how willing are those students to improve based on that feedback. We thought, we do a pre-measure, we give the education, they seek for the feedback, we do a post-measure, and we will see stunning increasing results. No. The perceptions became less favorable. And it's just to show that just make things mandatory won't lead to meaningful experiences. So a lot of the students reported back to us, I found it very difficult to elicit meaningful feedback from the patients. And sometimes having a good relationship with the patient was thought would be a good condition to receive constructive feedback. But afterwards the student said, maybe the patient didn't want to hurt my feelings and therefore was hesitant in giving critical feedback. It's not that easy to just make it mandatory and then all our problems will be solved. The same happened in the dissertation of Claudia Tielemans, and that was for feedback during medical rotations. So we used the feedback orientation scale, so 6 scales, in which we measured students' orientations towards giving and receiving feedback, using feedback at the workplace. We thought we'd do a pre-measurement and a post-measurement after the education. And yay, we saw an increase indeed in their orientations after we had taught them about feedback. Then they went into the field, into their rotations, and we said, go and practice with this. Go and do what we taught you in class. And we saw it decline again. Decline, it's my last name. How funny. Also, to show you, when they go out in the real world and try what we teach them or what we make mandatory will not automatically lead to meaningful experiences. One more example. Mina van Dorst, a current PhD student. She developed the Learning to Learn module before students go into their rotations. In her paper she has this visual. I understand you cannot read this whole, but let me just highlight, the power question is in there, the super question is in there, the Westerveld framework is in there. We're now in the phase of analyzing the transfer interviews with the students who took this course. And then one of them said, it broke my heart, you can imagine, power doesn't really work. But, and there came a very interesting thing, it did help me to ask more information-rich questions. So no, I don't go through all the steps of power, but I am a little bit more elaborate now in why I ask what I ask. The students said no transfer took place because they didn't strictly apply the power letters. But I was happy anyway, and I think this is the type of meaningful learning that we aim for when we teach students about feedback. It taught me a very interesting lesson to also tell students, it's not about the steps of power, it's not about the steps of super, it's about the idea behind it. I don't want you to just meaninglessly do stuff. So not just make it mandatory. This is my favorite slide. Can someone take a picture that I can show my kids? Who knows what this is? Yes, this is a Minecraft zombie. Beware of zombies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Anne de la Croix and Mario Veen, but they wrote in the medical education context a brilliant paper in which they warned us for reflective zombies. Students who've been conditioned to follow prescribed thought steps rather than engaging in truly reflective behavior. And I think we are really maybe risking, and maybe I invoke that even with my superpower well-intended acronyms, that we create feedback zombies. Students who are conditioned to go through predetermined steps but not show meaningful behavior. And I think it's always the tension in our designs. How do we design that we give students the opportunity to make meaningful sense of feedback, but we don't push them in the corridor that they go and have superficial behavior and thoughtlessly go through steps that they don't really feel or don't make sense to them. And now, checking the time, I want to make a small step to the word scaffolding of this talk. And even though most of my work takes place in the higher education context, in the medical education context, I want to take you to a study that we conducted with 3-year-olds. And I hope I can convince you that the findings of that study are also relevant for this audience. So, what does scaffolding mean? The idea of scaffolding is that you give support to students or children as long as they need it, but as soon as possible, decrease that support so that they can internalize the steps that we initially externally scaffolded. Often in literature, there's not enough attention on the fading away of the support and scaffolding. But what we did was we replicated one of the original scaffolding studies. Very funny that the author is called David Wood. Sometimes I feel like you need to be called David in order to do influential work. But for this David study, we rebuilt the puzzle that he made. And we just had to follow this rule, because this was what was found to be the basis of scaffolding. If the child succeeds, when next intervening, offer less help. If the child fails, when next intervening, take over more control. That sounds so easy. And that's the whole idea of scaffolding. Moving along with the students, thinking, how much support do you need? As soon as you don't need it anymore, I'm going to fade it away. And what did support mean for those 3-year-olds who had to build that tower? The lowest level of support was general encouragement. Keep on going. Try something else. Or specific verbal information. Maybe you should go and find the 4 biggest blocks. Or selection. Then the tutor would select the 4 biggest blocks, because that would be the ground floor of the pyramid, and move towards them. More control would be to put them together in this way so that the kid only had to do this. Click. And the most control was to just show it. To show to the kid, this is how it's done. And the whole idea was, if the child fails in the puzzle, then go up 1 level. If the child is successful, if you need to help them in another step, go up 1 level. It seemed so easy. And these were the original results of the 78 study, with 8 children per condition. The scaffolding kids highly outperformed students in other conditions, where there was only verbal encouragement, where there was only demonstration, or where they swang between demonstration and verbal support. And what did we find when we had our pre-registered replication with over 300 3-year-olds? This. No effect of scaffolding. And one of the tutors said, the scaffolding condition was the least adaptive thing I ever did. It was so scripted that there was no room for repetition of some support, for instance. And there was no room to adapt to what the kids showed. What if one of the 3-year-old boys said, hey, look at my new shoes? That was not in our protocol. But we learned that if we want to script being adaptive, we take away the thing that is really being adaptive, using all the cues that are in there. So in fact, our tutors in this study became the scaffolding zombies rather than the scaffolding experts. So that's where it brings us back to the idea, beware of zombies. We don't want our students to become feedback zombies, but also as feedback givers, we don't want to be feedback zombies. We don't want to check boxes and then say, we gave good feedback, or we designed good feedback. No solution is that simple that we can stop thinking and just have a system take it over. So we can make a lot of scaffolds, games, acronyms, feedback request forms, feedback processing forms, cover letters, toolkits, even though I love the toolkits. But I think the most important thing when it comes to designing is that we design opportunities for students to seek for feedback and to meaningfully engage with it in a meaningful way, without over-controlling what they do, so that we steer them in the corner of superficial tick-box behavior. And yes, that might mean that some students maybe don't engage with the feedback. Then the plot twist. I started off with those 6 pitfalls for feedback givers, to move on to the pitfalls of feedback users, or feedback receivers. I think would be our biggest pitfall that I would want to warn you for is that we believe that we should teach students how feedback works. I think that's the biggest pitfall we can step into if we also have the opportunity to show them how feedback works. That means don't show them the video with my bad hair day on YouTube and tell them, come back when you have a power question, but role model, ask power questions, ask information-rich questions to our students when we use their feedback. And the same holds for how we respond to feedback. Share with students how we use their feedback, what we changed in our education. As simple as me sharing with you why I had that water bottle up my slide there. It's my response to feedback. And it very much resonates, and I think, Margaret, you already mentioned the word vulnerability a few times this conference, with the lovely paper with Liz Malloy on intellectual candor. I think we step into a pitfall if we think we know how feedback works and we need to tell or teach others rather than live through it. So rather than having students as feedback users, that was the title, my plot twist would be, what about us as feedback users? What about us as feedback role models? And I mean you. This is also just to show my kids that I used Garfield in my presentation. How do we role model how feedback works? And just a final thought. One of our PhD students who graduated last year, Isabella Spaans, she studied how medical students look for role models in medical education. And what we saw, the most interesting finding was that a role model is never one person, but it's like a mosaic. So students see different people do different things, different doctors, different teachers, and they take things from each and every one of them. Maybe not each and every one of them. Some are troll models. So they think, that's what I'm not gonna do. But they compile their own role model, and that's why I think being a role model doesn't have to be so tough. You're never the only role model. If we do our best, we can become part of the feedback mosaic role models that students make. Why would we tell them that feedback is a lifelong learning skill if we are professionals and don't show them how we do that? How are we doing time-wise? Can I do the sneak peek?
1 minute.
1 minute. Perfect. So, remember this. The focus is relevant, but 4 reviews to work on. What I wanted to share with you is that we interviewed medical residents and we asked them, how do you seek for feedback in your residency? How do you approach your supervisor when you do that? And when don't you approach them to ask for feedback? And we analyzed those interviews. And what struck me is that the most recurring considerations are 2 aspects. The first one is vulnerability. So how vulnerable do I, as a medical resident, dare to be with this specific person? Do I trust that I don't get caught on something vulnerable that I share, that I worry about in a later stage? And if there's that trust and they can be vulnerable, then the medical residents will approach the medical specialist and say, hey, you know that patient from yesterday? I'm not sure if I handled that in the best way. I did this and this, but maybe I should have done it differently. What do you think about it? And the other thing that they weigh in is how much time or effort can and will I ask of someone who's already super busy. I think it makes a lot of sense. But I think this vulnerability is really a call to action for all of us. I've seen it in this conference, so it is a bit preaching to the choir. So, these are a few of the people that I dare to be vulnerable with, that I ask for feedback, and that sometimes unsolicited or solicited give me feedback. This is maybe my feedback mosaic. And my question to you would be, if you had to compile your mosaic, who are the people you ask for feedback in a vulnerable way? Not when you think, I'm good, right? When you want to just receive a compliment. Thank you for your attention. Let's stay in touch.
Colleagues, questions? Trying to see if I can put any questions.
I understand you're all tired.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay, we've got one here.
Thanks so much, Rinska. Just glorious, and just brought a whole lot of stuff so beautifully together. I guess my question is, is around what do you think people should do when conditions aren't good? Because sometimes in feedback seeking, I mean, I study medical education a bit, and sometimes just conditions aren't right. How do we go about? There are moments where you shouldn't be vulnerable. There are moments where bearing it all is really not. How do we go about that in this sort of dream design world?
So I think ideally the medical doctors wouldn't mind being vulnerable too. Because what we now sometimes see is that when students ask questions, why do we do things this way here, then the medical specialist is offended. Like, why would you ask that? So I think there's a long way to go. And the design question, I think it's an almost impossible trade-off. So if I look at the the curriculum reform that's taking place in my own department now, the plans are that students have to collect feedback, one feedback situation every day. But what would happen then? So then that will maybe lead to superficial behavior. But we want to do that. We want them to do something at least. So then all of a sudden you're talking about numbers. So then they ask me, okay, Renske, if not 5 a week, then what? 2? 1? I don't know. Whatever is most meaningful to the student. And I think we try to build this in our curricula so that we have students have the opportunity to seek for feedback, that they can tell the doctors, I need to do this for my studies. And then hopefully they will engage in meaningful feedback encounters. There's still a long way to go in our medical education, at least. Yeah.
We have one at the back.
Okay, and then I've got one over here after that.
Still energy for running?
Yes.
I'm asking you, is that working?
No.
Oh, please, that.
There's a button on the
Is that better?
There's an on-off button.
Let's go for this one first and we'll sort that out.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Renske, for this wonderful presentation. And as you might know, I'm using your superpower closer acronyms in my own work as a teacher. And well, if you ask me, it works brilliantly. And I'm even surprised to have a new cohort of students. And I think, oh, we have to teach them again on how to ask good feedback questions. But my own question to you would be, when you showed your model with the sense making and the using, and you said something like, the student will go out of the room and try to make sense of the feedback. And I was wondering, do you think that should be part of the feedback dialogue? It sounded like the student has to do it alone and not together with the mentors or supervisors or more knowledgeable others. What are your thoughts on that?
In the dream world, with limitless time, yes, then I would hope I would be next to the student, or the teacher could be next to the student. I don't think it's feasible. I do think that those intervision kind of sessions in which peers together analyze and support each other in making sense of the feedback helps a lot. So I think it's not feasible. Would I want that in my ideal dream world? Definitely. Because I think it would teach us also a lot about why the student didn't initially go for the route that we proposed, for instance, in the feedback. So I think it would teach us maybe even more about how students try and make sense of the things that we, very well-intentioned, put them up with.
Hi. Yeah, this one's working. This is quite a specific question and almost expecting you to have a crystal ball, so I apologise. But I was really interested in what you said about the zombies, particularly in relation to medical education. And I wondered if the longer term implications for increasing authenticity and for changing medical practice because that's something, I have a long-term health condition. I have noticed that if you seem to move off of the checklist, sometimes medical professionals don't quite know what to do with that. And that kind of reflection and critical thinking of joining dots rather than repeating something memorised by rote, which is what I feel medical professionals seem to be, as patients, seem to be very strongly trained to do. What implications teaching these types of skills through feedback might have beyond the immediate sort of assessment?
Yeah, I think, but I'm grateful for your disclaimer up front that the crystal ball is not the real situation. So I think the dream there would indeed be that we also maybe wire the professional of the future with the idea that you won't know everything after you've finished your degree. You will have to keep learning and developing, even if you're in the same workplace all the time, let alone if you would transfer to other situations. So I think the whole idea of the adaptive professional, the continuous learner, I think that hasn't landed in all of the medical departments yet.
I mean, doctors do continuously learn, but it's the adaptive part. There's a constant memorisation and remote sort of learning rather than that flexible adaptive skill.
And I think this is related also to that idea of scaffolding. So I think a lot of the things that is rote learning, or at least if it's steps, so in our curriculum it's also the ABCDE, for instance, for medical students. And I think that is very helpful and is a scaffold that at some point you would hope gets internalized and becomes more meaningful, and that it can then be played with a bit more, made personal. So you would start with, I don't know, some prescribed steps, and that the real professional then starts owning it and making it their own. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe come back in a few years' time with a study.
Yeah. When I looked into it, the crystal ball.
Shall we call it? Yes. Okay. Brent, thank you very much indeed. And now I've left my notes over there, so I'll see if I can remember my 3 thank yous. Thank you to some 2 excellent keynote speakers and all our presenters, and to you for your contribution with your concise and cutting-edge questions. And a big thank you to the hotel staff who've looked after us, and most of all, a big thank you to Linda Shaw, our conference manager, who in the end makes it all happen. So thank you to all of those people. I also would like to say a big thank you to the exhibitors who contribute to the conference and give us another dimension and an interest in what we're doing. I would like to say to you, please do try, I know you get lots of emails, but try and complete the feedback survey. We do take it very seriously. The committee will be meeting in September, and you can make suggestions and all sorts of things like that. We take it very seriously, even if we don't seem to. We suppose we should do that institutional thing and show you what we're changing, but we're not going to do that. But we do take it very seriously. And finally, have a safe onward or homeward journey. Thank you very much indeed, colleagues.